Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Susan AcKah. I'm the Regional Manager for Globethics in Western Africa, and I'm assisting in the Globethics in the MENA region, and also your training coordinator for the Anti-Corruption Train the Training program we are here to launch today. I bring you warm greetings on behalf of the collaborating institutions, the World Federation of Engineering Organizations Committee on Anti-Corruption, the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, and the Globethics Foundation in the MENA region. Thank you all to you, our distinguished guests and registered participants, for making time to join us today and for your registered interest in this program. Along the way, we have received diverse support from members of the collaborating institutions and various agencies from around the world, as we can see in the registrations we have received so far. I will leave the specific acknowledgements to Mr. Kamel Ayadi, who will be moderating the sessions today, but allow me to say a big thank you, all protocol observed, please. Before I hand over to Mr. Ayadi, I would like to present a brief breakdown of today's agenda and a few points for us to note. I will quickly share my screen so you get to see what I am talking about. Okay. So today's meeting will be in two sessions. In the very first session, pardon me, is the introductory session where we'll be launching this long-awaited Training of Trainers Anti-Corruption Program. We'll be welcoming the president of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations in the person of Mustapha Shehu, who will bring us a quick greeting, and also my own boss, Fadi Daou, the executive director of Globethics. They will bring us brief opening remarks. Then in the second session, we will go into the business of the day, which is the first suit in the training program, which will be handled by Neill Stansbury, the co-founder and director of the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center International. He will be speaking on why infrastructure projects are prone to corruption. After his presentation, there will be some brief discussions. You can bring in all your questions, some brief reactions, and then we'll go ahead with the closing formalities for the day. Please go ahead and introduce yourself using the chat box on your screen. Please introduce your name, your institution, which part of the world you are joining us from, any comments that you need to make. As we go on with today's interactions, please send your questions in the Q&A box. We'll make every attempt to try to answer your questions live. Otherwise, our speakers and panelists will answer them right there in the Q&A box. So without further ado, allow me to welcome, moderating the sessions today, Mr. Kamel Ayadi, the founding chairperson of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations Anti-Corruption Committee, to take over the sessions today. Mr. Ayadi, the podium is yours, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are. We have participants from 47 countries, including participants who are connecting from countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, which is too late for them. So a special welcome to these people. Thank you for participating in the launch event of the Train the Trainers program. I warmly welcome all of you and hope that you remain as engaged and numerous throughout the entire training, which begins today and will conclude in approximately 9 months. This initiative is the result of a close collaboration between 3 partner institutions: the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, represented by the Committee on Anti-Corruption hosted by Tunisia, the Geneva-based Globethics Foundation, represented by MENA Regional Office, in the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, GIACC International. Today, we are privileged to welcome the leadership of these three esteemed institutions. Engineer Mustapha Shehu, president of the WFEO, was supposed to be here with us, but he was prevented from doing so because he has another commitment, and he sent a recorded speech, which you will have the chance to see in a moment. Dr. Fadi Daou, Executive Director of Globethics, and Neill Stansbury, co-founder and Director of GIACC International. Thank you so much for agreeing to address this webinar and for your valuable support of this initiative. I would also like to acknowledge the participation of Engineer Sang Chuan Tan, President-elect of the WFEO, who is connecting from Singapore now, and members of the executive councils of the WFEO, as well as GIACC affiliates and members of Globethics. Having worked closely with each of these three organizations from different perspectives over years, I can say with certainty that they share many common values and goals. I hope that this collaboration will continue beyond this initiative. Several key factors give me confidence in the success and the impact of this initiative. Let me highlight the most obvious. The first, I anticipate a high level of motivation from participants, as most of them have been carefully selected and appointed by their organizations with a commitment, and I wanted to underline commitment, to support them in replicating this training for their colleagues. Second, the quality of the expert instructors is outstanding. They are highly skilled and senior experts in their respective fields. I would like to warmly welcome them and express my sincere gratitude for their willingness to share their expertise. Let me introduce them now, and please raise your hand so that participants can recognize you. Neill Stansbury, who is the co-organizer and highly qualified instructor. Michael Kramer from United States. Christoph Stuckelberger. I think he's not joining us, but he will be joining in the appropriate time. Joshua George from India. He's connected and he's here. Olivier Guillot from France. Paul Haywood from United Kingdom, and myself, Kamel Ayadi from Tunisia. I cannot thank you enough for your commitment and enthusiasm in making this initiative reality. The third element that makes me confident about the outcome and impact of this training is the diversity and richness of the content of the training. At the beginning of the planning of the training program, the content was focused mainly on corruption in infrastructure. But over time, we have been able to broaden the scope of the training to other aspects, such as the investigation of corruption, conflict of interest, the ethical dimension of corruption, and artificial intelligence, and so on. Lastly, the fourth element, which is equally important, is accessibility. Some of you may remember that 16 years ago, we ran a similar initiative within the WFEO to train trainers on anti-corruption. At that time, participation was limited to WFEO members who could afford the travel costs. Participation in this training is open to members of the three partners institutions. And participation requires only motivation and an internet connection. No registration fees, no time spent at airport, no travel cost, and so on. Of course, this is thanks to the technology that allows us to meet and to hold training online. But this is also made possible thanks to the effort of the organizers and instructors who contribute to this initiative on a voluntary basis, which is another reason for me to thank them once again. I would also like to acknowledge the contribution of Globethics, Dr. Fadi, for the significant logistical support in communicating and coordinating the program, as well as the technical communication support from the WFEO headquarters in Paris. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Josie from Globethics. And thank you, Ivan from WFEO headquarters for the excellent work you have done so far and that we expect from you in the future. So please enjoy this opportunity. Thank you for listening. Now I turn the floor to Neill Stansbury to say a few words, then to play the recording that was sent by President Mustapha, and then Fadi to deliver his welcome speech. Neill, the floor is yours, Neill.
Thank you very much, Kamel, and thank you very much, Susan, for your inspiring introductory words. I just will say a very few words now because I will be delivering the first session about infrastructure corruption, why infrastructure projects are prone to corruption after the introductory addresses. But just what I'd like to say now is it's a great pleasure on behalf of the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center and many of our national affiliates who are actually participating today. Great pleasure to welcome everyone today to this first of the many workshops. And thank you to Kamel and Susan for your inspired work in developing this program and leading it. I think this is going to be a fantastic initiative. I think all of us here on this connection today are well aware of the damage and the costs caused by corruption. And that is the reason why we are sitting here today. And I know the president of WFEO will be addressing directly in his address shortly some of these costs and damages caused by corruption. But I'd just like to comment that preventing corruption is not easy. You can't just turn a switch and switch it off. It is difficult to prevent corruption because it's a very complicated and detailed issue, which has a lot of tentacles, a lot of webs. But it's possible. We do now know how to prevent corruption. We do know what has to be done. We do know what the systems and controls are. So we are very advanced in our thinking now internationally as to how to stop this plague of corruption. The challenge we have is merely to persuade decision makers in public sector and the private sector who have the power and influence to do it, to persuade them to implement the necessary controls and to take the appropriate action. That is our challenge. It's not why, it's how to implement. And basically, there are three key areas of implementation we have to focus on. Firstly, raising awareness. Secondly, controls. And thirdly, enforcement. Those are the three key legs. Raising awareness is making sure that everyone in connection with the industry understands how corruption takes place, why it takes place, when it takes place, where it takes place, and how to prevent it and how to investigate it and deal with it. This understanding level has to be increased so people know what is to be done. Secondly, the control environment. Once we know what is to be done, we have to make sure all the appropriate controls are in place, because you cannot just say stop corruption. You have to have a control environment. And so these controls are controls which have to be put in place by government, by the courts, by Parliament, by public sector organizations, by the regulators, by private sector organizations, professional institutions, a controlled environment of management systems and actions designed to prevent corruption and to deal with it if it does take place. And thirdly, finally, we have to recognize that even with the best awareness raising and the best controls in the world, there are still going to be some people who will defy those controls and will try to be corrupt, because unfortunately, there are people who inherently will always try to do so. So to take account of that, we have to have a proper enforcement environment. We have to therefore make sure we have an environment where we can report corruption safely and effectively, where there'll be effective investigation of corruption. And if it is found to have taken place, it has to be prosecuted. And if proven, it has to be dealt with effectively and proper punishment meted out. So we do need those three key areas in place: the raising awareness, the controls, and the enforcement. These workshops over the next 6 months are, of course, focused on the first element of raising awareness, because we want to raise the awareness of all the participants in this workshop of exactly how corruption takes place, why it takes place, and how to prevent it and how to investigate and enforce it. So to understand all those three elements. And then we're very much hoping that inspired people who are attending these workshops will themselves become trainers and will take their knowledge and inspiration to train others, to raise awareness worldwide. And so hopefully these workshops will be a key part in the global battle against corruption. So thank you very much for allowing me to say those introductory words, and I hand back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Neill. Already, I'm taking away some points: awareness, controls, and enforcement. These are key points that we need to work with in our fight against corruption, not just for us, whether we are in the engineering field, but in every aspect of our lives. I can speak to that even in Ghana here with the issues that we are facing currently. So thank you already, Neill, for your introductory statement. I will go ahead now and share a video from the president of the WFEO. He sends his apologies because he couldn't make it, but then he's with us and he graciously sent us a video so that we can also get to hear his remarks. I'm sharing that right now. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, fellow engineers, esteemed colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which side of the globe you are listening to us. It is a great honor to be here with you today addressing the issue that transcends borders, industries, and professions: the prevention and investigation of corruption. Corruption is a global challenge that undermines development, compromises safety, and erodes trust. As engineers, we have a critical role to play in safeguarding our profession from the devastating effect of corruption and upholding the highest level of ethical standards. Before I continue, let me commend the effort of Mr. Kamel Ayadi, the chairman of WFEO Committee on Anti-Corruption, and the MENA Regional Consul of Globethics for organizing this program, as well as the partners on this event, the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, GIACC. The aim is to train trainers on what is corruption, the devastating effects it has in our society, how do we prevent it, as well as investigate it. The overall objective is to prevent and minimize corruption to the barest minimum in our society for the common good of all. The role of the engineers. Engineering is more than a profession. It is a commitment to public safety, to sustainability, and to advancing the well-being of the society. It is also a trust. Every day, engineers design, build, and maintain infrastructure and technologies that form the backbone of modern civilization. From energy and transportation to healthcare and digital systems, engineers are entrusted with the responsibilities that directly impact on the safety and quality of lives of billions of people. However, with huge responsibility comes greater accountability. When corruption infiltrates engineering projects, whether through bribery, fraud, or negligence, it is not just profits and reputations that are at stake. Lives can be lost, resources could be wasted, and communities can be exposed to short and long-term suffering. The impact of corruption in engineering and society are so many, because it leads to compromised quality and safety of infrastructure. Corrupt practices result in substandard materials and construction, which can lead to catastrophic failures. We have seen bridges collapse, buildings crumbling, and infrastructure deteriorate, all due to the corruption undermining the integrity of engineering work. Inflated project cost. Corruption inflates project cost through bribery, fraud, and opaque procurement processes that drive up expenses, diverting funds that could be used for better quality materials or additional services. This also reduces the rate of return on investment, thereby discouraging investors from utilizing their resources to more beneficial projects for the community. Delayed projects. Delayed projects could be caused by a use of unprofessional personnel for a project which is due to corruption. Corrupt practices lead to insufficiency and delays, which in turn cause disruption in essential services and economic development. Loss of public trust is perhaps one of the most devastating and damaging factors that destroys public confidence in engineers, in governments, and in institutions. Trust is the cornerstone of our profession, and when it is eroded, the social contract between the engineers and society is broken. Erosion of professional ethics brings about compromises in integrity of the engineering profession. When engineers participate in or are pressured into corrupt practices, such as accepting bribes and approving faulty design or certifying unqualified contractors, it undermines their ethical responsibilities. This can damage the reputation of the profession as a whole. Hindrance to innovation by stifling competitiveness in awarding projects to weaker firms against those with cutting-edge technologies to give project the highest expertise it deserves. The above listed are issues of serious concern to us as engineers and to us as responsible citizens of our countries and of global community. Therefore, we must do all it takes to prevent their occurrences strategically through the following actions, even though not limitative. Number one, establishing a culture of integrity by advocating ethical standards and code of conduct within the engineering organizations, as well as continuous training on ethics for engineers. At the World Federation of Engineering Organization, we have model code of ethics, which we have circulated among our national and international member organizations, who in turn will circulate to their individual members for compliance. We are also aware that in some countries, engineers are made to take an oath of compliance with the set of ethical standards as they are inducted into the membership of those professional bodies. Implementing robust policies of transparent procurement processes also helps in minimizing corruption in engineering projects. Engineering institutions are encouraged to collaborate with government entities to develop and enforce anti-corruption laws and regulations. For example, in Nigeria, the Council for Regulation of Engineering in Nigeria has partnered with the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission, ICPC, to have the current tribunal where practitioners are brought in cases of professional misconduct between parties or issues related to project failures or building collapses. Technology can also be used as a tool for transparency, for example, in combating corruption, like using blockchain technology for contracts and utilizing digital reporting systems. Using these tools, records cannot be changed by corrupt clerks and bureaucrats. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, with these few remarks, I want to hand over this session to the subject matter experts to give the session the due professional attention it deserves. I thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Ayadi, the floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you. Now the floor is to Fadi Daou, Dr. Fadi Daou, Executive Director of Globethics, for his welcome speech. Fadi, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Kamel. Hello, everybody. I send you my greetings from Geneva, Switzerland, where the head office of Globethics is based. And I would like to start my brief address by a word of gratitude and congratulations. Gratitude first goes to Kamel, because as it was already said, he's, I would say, the mastermind and the bridge that brought all the partners, the three partners together in this project and designed the project. Kamel, we really are full of gratitude for your efforts and for your role in bringing together Globethics with the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center and the World Federation of Engineering Organizations. I'm proud that our three organizations are joining their efforts to serve this extremely important mission of preventing corruption globally. And congratulations for this very exciting program that you are able to put together. So this is why I would like to extend also my gratitude to all the instructors who are offering their times, their precious time to also to deliver those sessions and train the trainers. My second remark goes to the participants themselves. I'm so proud to see, had been looking at the chat and seeing all the names from so different countries. We have more than connected, at least now I know the registers are more than that, but more than 80, we have 87 connected people online now from more than 40 countries, Kamel, you mentioned. This is by itself a very encouraging sign of people who would like to change the reality within their own institutions and their national or contextual environments. And so I would like to congratulate you, all the participants, and really commend you for the choice you made to join this training, because you are joining this training as trainers. This is a training for trainers. So this means that we also consider you as change makers, as full participants in the process itself, and not just receiving the knowledge. This is not a program to increase your knowledge. This is a program to empower you in your action in facing corruptions and preventing corruption within your institutions and within your national or international settings. So congratulations for the choice you made, and wish you all the best for this very exciting experience you will have throughout this training. And finally, I will add one word about the topic itself. So it's about preventing and investigating corruption. In addition to what had been said by Neill, and thank you for your remarks, and by the message of Mustapha, I would like to add two words. The first one of them is accountability. I worked in many countries of the world, and I saw the huge suffering and incredibly bad situation in societies. Society is almost dying because of corruption, and corruption leading to a complete impunity in the societies. And this is the most catastrophic situation, when in fact corruption goes hand in hand with impunity. So it's very important to have awareness. It's very important to have systems in place, but it's, I would say, more important to apply those systems to make sure that accountability is considered as a positive value. Unfortunately, in some minds, accountability sometimes it's about more, it's perceived like a sanction process, and so has a negative connotation. However, without accountability, there is no progress in life, wherever it is. So this is my first message. And the second one is about integrity, because we can fight corruption, but I would say the best result we can obtain is to support people who are promoting and engaging themselves based on integrity. So definitely we need to prevent, we need to fight, we need to face all situations related to corruption, but we need also to empower, to support all people who are committed to their engagement with full integrity. And this is, I would say, the main purpose of Globethics. We do believe that compliance is important, whatever it applies, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but not enough. As a process, we need with compliance ethics, and ethics, which means that this is the power that comes with value-rooted, value-based commitment to any type of work or engagement. So congratulations again. Thank you again, Kamel. We are really proud of our MENA Center with your great leadership to be so leading with our partners this initiative. I would like also, as you mentioned, to extend my gratitude to all the people, our team, and the teams in other organizations who helped in putting together this program and will continue helping in this process. Thank you all. Congratulations. And I look forward to meet you at the end of the program to congratulate you and celebrate your graduation. Thanks.
Thank you, Fadi, for your insightful thoughts. Thank you also for your support, because I know that you have provided great support to the success of this initiative. My dream is that the three partner organizations can come together to work in the future for other initiatives, because as I said earlier, there are a lot common values that the three organizations they share. And thank you also for stressing the need and the crucial dimension of fighting corruption, which is the individual integrity. And I know how Globethics is active and is doing to improve and to promote ethics and individual integrity, which is an essential component in fighting corruption. So now we will move to the first presentation, which will be given by Neill Stansbury. As you have received in the program, it's about why are prone to corruption. So you will be in the best hands in talking about corruption, fighting corruption in infrastructure project, because Neill Stansbury is a real expert in this. I have known Neill for almost 2 decades now, and we worked in a number of initiatives. Some initiatives are real landmark. I would just mention 1 or 2 of them, which is the drafting of the ISO standard 37001 about anti-bribery management system, with Neill, who led this initiative and who was behind this initiative, because he previously led the group, the British group, who worked on the development of the BS, British standard 10,500, about the standard on anti-bribery management standard. So Neill is the co-founder and director of the Global Infrastructure Anti-Corruption Center, which is present in Tunisia for now more than 10 years. He is a construction lawyer who has worked for over 40 years in the international infrastructure sector. He was chairman of the International Organization for Standardization, as I said earlier, on anti-corruption by anti-bribery project committee, which published the ISO 37001. He was an independent anti-corruption compliance monitor of Balfour Beatty, Pearson Brinkhoff, and Mabi Bridge. He has given anti-corruption presentation and workshop in over 40 countries. Neill, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much, Kamel. I'll call up my slides. Susan, are those slides visible on the screen? Thank you very much. So thank you very much for those inspiring words by everyone introducing this workshop today. So I suppose it's now down to the basics, is how are we going to do this? What do we need to do? And of the 16 workshops which will be taking place over the next 6 months, there'll be 8 of them which I'll be given, which are some GIACC workshops. And they're going to be these following 8 workshops. They are integrated in the sense that to get a full picture of what we need to do, you need to really ideally take part in all the workshops. The first 2 are introductory, why infrastructure projects are prone to corruption, and secondly, the contractual structure, rights and obligations. They set the picture of the type of environments which corruption takes place and can flourish. So the first one looks at the particular peculiarities of the infrastructure sector and why that helps corruption takes place. It's reputed to be one of the most corrupt sectors in the world, infrastructure. Why is that? Is there anything specific about these projects which makes corruption easier to take place and more difficult to uncover? That's workshop 1, which we'll be looking at today. Then in 2 weeks' time, there's workshop 2, which looks at the contractual structure, rights and obligations of infrastructure projects. This is very important because if you're going to understand how corruption takes place on an infrastructure project, you have to understand in some detail the structure of the contractual structure, how everyone fits together, that the employer, the main contractor, the subcontractors, the suppliers, the consultants, how they fit together contractually, and also what their rights and obligations are under those contracts. Because I have found from my 40 years in the industry investigating corruption that a lot of corruption is hidden in the contract structure and the rights and obligations. It's very difficult to dig out because it's such a complicated structuring, and the rights and obligations are so complex that the corruption is often hidden amidst those clauses and in those documents. So only when you fully understand what those rights and obligations are and what the documents are which enforce those, can you really get to grips with how corruption takes place. Then, having understood the background, the environment in sections 1 and 2, we then move on to an explanation of how corruption takes place. And it's divided into 2 workshops: how it takes place in the procurement phase and how it takes place in the construction phase, because there are very different types of of corruption during those 2 phases. And those 2 workshops look in a lot of detail at the different types of corruption, like bribery, fraud, cartels, abuse of office, embezzlement, money laundering, and how specifically do they take place in those phases. Once you understand how they take place, it's much easier to understand how to prevent it. And therefore, workshops 5 and 6 look at prevention mechanisms, the controls I talked about earlier during the procurement phase and the construction phase. What management systems, what controls, what types of monitoring, and what types of auditing, what types of investigation, what evaluation, what do you specifically need to do day to day on a construction project to prevent corruption taking place during those 2 phases. And finally, if you understand how it takes place, then what happens if you have to investigate it? How do you look for it? Because we find that many investigators don't know enough about a construction project to be effective investigators. They get put off the scent by clever people who bamboozle them with documentation and explanations the investigators don't understand. So it's very important that investigators know what to look for, who to talk to, which documents to compare. How do you dig deep into the construction project to uncover corruption? And those 2 workshops are again divided into procurement and construction. Now, strictly speaking, not everyone would need to attend all 8, because you could say people who never investigate corruption don't need to attend 7 and 8. And you could say that investigators don't need to learn how to prevent it under 5 and 6. But I would say that learning the whole picture is much more valuable because you understand the whole picture. And so these 8 workshops are designed to be integrated and holistic and give you an overall idea of the whole issue of corruption, how it takes place, how to prevent it, and how to investigate it, as I sort of defined earlier. And the slides are very detailed. They're very content heavy, which makes it quite easy for people who are trained, the trainers, to actually provide these training workshops, because there's a very powerful base for the workshops. It's also very easy for people taking the course to refer to the slides later to give themselves tips as to what to do in certain situations. But I emphasize that these slides are basically an international concept, and therefore many people will find it quite useful to adapt slides to local conditions. And therefore, if you are giving these training workshops in a specific country, you may well find it useful to perhaps delete some of the material, replace it with some of your own, or expand from a national perspective on the material in the workshop, because we're very keen that these workshops work for your country and for your particular parts of the industry. So they are designed to be adapted by the trainers to utilize in your own country and for your own specific needs. So with that background, I'll move into the first of the 8 workshops. I'd ask for all questions to be put into the chat box. Then the panel can take certain questions and deal with them. But and we won't be taking questions live, and we won't be taking them during the workshop because there are too many people on the call for that to take place. So any questions, please put in the Q&A box, not the chat box. And then we will deal as far as we can with the questions during the discussion section. So the first of the 8 workshops, why infrastructure projects are prone to corruption. So firstly, just a bit of definition. What do we mean by infrastructure project? For the purpose of these workshops, we use that term very broadly. Any project in the built environment, road, railway, airport, bridge, power station, hospital, school, building, anything in the built environment we term as an infrastructure project. And critically, the second question, what do you mean by corruption? A lot of people use the term corruption very differently worldwide. Some people use the term quite narrowly to be some form of abuse of office, or abuse of your public position, or private gain. We prefer at GIACC to use the term much more broadly, and we use it to encompass as an umbrella term any of the criminal offences which can take place, which involve some form of deception for gain. And these would include fraud, bribery, extortion, cartels. And we also, which I won't deal with specifically in this workshop, we also encompass other criminal offences such as abuse of office, embezzlement, and money laundering within our definition of corruption. But in these workshops, I'm going to focus on big 4, fraud, bribery, extortion, and cartels. But we use this term broadly because there's no point talking about fraud on the one hand, bribery on the other hand, corruption on the other hand, all as separate concepts which need to be dealt with separately. They don't. They all involve dishonesty. They all involve personal gain. They're all hidden, and often they all take place at the same time. So one particular criminal act may involve all the criminal offences of fraud, bribery, extortion, cartel, embezzlement. It may involve the lot with money laundering consequent on the criminal act. So what we say is, let's be very broad. Corruption encompasses all of these offences. Let's understand how all of them take place, and let's put controls in place throughout the contract cycle which deal with all of these offences. Infrastructure projects are widely regarded as being prone to corruption. Why is that? We think that there are many factors which facilitate corruption on infrastructure projects. They make corruption hard to prevent, much easier to take place and hard to detect. And therefore, it becomes a bit of a hotbed of corruption if you're not careful. It's much easier to implement effective anti-corruption measures and to identify and investigate corruption if you understand these background factors which percolate through the industry and do enable the concealment and facilitation of corruption. So we're going to today just look at these factors as a bit of background. I've listed here a number of them, and we'll go through them one by one. I won't read them all out from the slide, but you can see them all on the slide ahead of you, and I'll deal with them one by one. Firstly, infrastructure projects tend to have a very complex contractual structure. They tend to have a large number of project participants. And you have the project owner at the top, sometimes called the employer. And then the project owner may borrow money for the project from funders, the banks, or share investors. They may appoint one contractor or many contractors, build the project, and those contractors may appoint subcontractors, suppliers, and consultants actually to build parts of the project, supply materials, and provide services and advice to the project. So there are a large different number of types of participants, and they are all linked together in a complex contractual structure. Sometimes the structure can have hundreds of contractual links. Every time you have a contractual link between two contractual participants, it opens the door to potential corruption, because there could be a bribe paid to win that particular contract. When the contract is awarded, there could be fraud in the execution of that particular contract, exaggerated claims, falsified documents, exaggerated demands for payment or extension of time. There could be fraud in each of the items of work falling within each type of contract. So many contracts are involved in the project and many opportunities for corruption in each of those projects. And this corruption cost is passed up the contractual chain normally, and often ultimately is borne by the project owner. And this is particularly the case if the project is a public sector project owner. Corruption right at the bottom of the contractual chain gets passed up to the next body in the contractual chain, compounds their contract price, which gets passed up even higher. So there's no question of bribery or something or fraud costing, say, 5% of the contract price, because it happens all the way through the contract chain, compounding all the way up. So even if each link in the chain was to say cost 5%, just as a wild guess, then that wouldn't be 5% of the contract price. It would be compounded 5, 10, 15, 20, 25%, all the way up the contract chain. So if we look at the next diagram, it illustrates what I'm talking about. So if at the top you have a project owner, a Ministry of Roads, perhaps in the public sector, or the owner of a building in the private sector, they may appoint the project funder for money. They may have insurers providing project insurance. They may have an engineer designing the project. They may have a main contractor appointed to build the entire project. The main contractor then may appoint a civil works subcontractor, a building works subcontractor, a plant subcontractor perhaps. And they in turn will appoint subcontractors, suppliers, consultants, etc. And so I have a very simple chart there, but in reality, the chart goes down many layers below that to result in perhaps 50, 100 links in the contractual chain. And as I mentioned before, every link provides an opportunity for corruption in the procurement, in the construction, bribery to get contracts, bribery to get permits, work approved, fraud in the work done, fraud in your claims. A massively compounding effect, therefore. And as I said earlier, corruption on any one of those boxes gets passed all the way up, compounding until it hits the project owner with a hugely overpriced and effective project. So that's a structure. But also within that structure, the documentation is very complicated. So the construction contracts, every link in that chain has a complicated construction contract. And these can be very complex. They can have hundreds of pages of contract conditions, technical specifications, bills of quantities, drawings, and programs. And the main contract, with all that documentation of hundreds or thousands of pages, will often be duplicated and copied down to the subcontractors and the suppliers and get passed down in sometimes simplified and sometimes not simplified form all the way down the contract chain. So you end up with a massively complex web of contract documents which support the massively complex contractual web of companies. So for people who don't understand it, such as public officials who want to stop corruption or investigators looking into it, they are going to sink unless they have expert help or unless they understand it. Because how do you even know where to start looking for the corruption in a complex contractual and documentation web such as this? So this becomes a very major obstacle to effective monitoring and investigation, because the corruption can be hidden within the contractual structure and can be hidden with the contractual documentation and be very difficult to find. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are a series of integrated workshops here, and in a separate workshop, how corruption takes place, I'm going to examine how corruption takes place in the various aspects of the project, such as variations, extensions of time, bills of quantity, loss and expense, etc. And I'm going to explain how the corruption gets concealed in these documents. And I'll explain how you can look at the documents and compare them and dig deep and find out where the corruption is. So this will come in later workshops. Thirdly, within this complex contractual structure and complex web of documentation, a lot is happening on site, a lot of physical activities. An infrastructure project is normally a massive conglomeration of thousands, hundreds of thousands of unique activities. Delivery of 1 cubic meter of excavation, delivery of a cubic meter of aggregate, delivery of a cubic meter of concrete, of square meters of brickwork, blockwork, roof cladding. And all of these cubic meters and square meters are aggregated one by one to result in a project. Every cubic meter, every square meter needs to be of the correct quality, the correct quantity, and need to be fit for purpose. And similarly, you have linear meters of piping and ducting and numbers of light fittings and boilers and taps, literally hundreds of thousands of separate items being amalgamated together into one project. Every item there needs to be approved by someone in terms of quality and quantity at some stage of the project cycle and at some level in the contract structure. You turn a blind eye to delivery of concrete in your foundations, and you could result in a totally defective and dangerous project. You don't check whether the proper steelwork is being put in the foundations and your building could fall down. If the excavation is not done to the correct depth, your project may not be founded on proper base material. So your eyes have to be totally open to correct delivery of all these numerous different measurable activities. And of course, this opens the door. And in my view, this is at the heart of the most significant loss of money on construction projects, is the loss of money through fake, false delivery of items in terms of quantity and quality, and false claiming for work which was not done. It's very difficult to monitor and calculate that all the correct quality and quantity is being delivered day in, day out. And secondly, there's a massive opportunity for fraud, pretending you've done more work than you have, delivering steel of inferior quality, delivering concrete without the correct cement composition. And you can make a lot of money by falsifying quantity and quality. This is where millions and billions get lost in the construction field and where projects get defective and where the corruption takes place. So effective monitoring of the process is at the heart of corruption prevention. This, of course, means tremendous trust is placed on all the people you put in place to monitor. Every supervisor you put in place, every tester, every certifier is being trusted to actually approve all these items. And that makes them a prime target for bribery. because the amount of money that can be saved by defective work is massive compared to the amount of money you have to bribe a certifier to approve it. So you have, in this area of measurable activities, a significant corruption faced with bribery and fraud. Diversity of skills is another factor. The infrastructure industry is unusual for the phenomenal number of different skills playing a part. You have your professionals, architects, engineers, quantity surveyors, accountants, lawyers, bankers, etc. You have your trades, such as machine operators, concrete pourers, steel fixers, scaffolders, pipe fitters, plasterers, electricians, etc. And you have your specialist contractors, excavation, foundations, civil works, building works, insulation, roofing, mechanical and electrical, etc. Tremendous diversity. And this leads to different standards of qualification, different standards of integrity, different standards of oversight. You have no one organization you can turn to in infrastructure and say, we've got to get a grip of integrity here, because there are just so many different trades and professions involved, so many different organizations. There's no one interface that you can deal with. And so that causes terrific difficulties in site management and monitoring. Also, the number of project phases. A major infrastructure project may have different phases, such as project selection, when you choose which project is going to be built. Then you plan the project, then you design it, then you organize the financing, then you procure the companies to do the work, then they do the work. Then once it's built, you operate and maintain the project. Every phase tends to have a handover from one participant to another. They may not necessarily be sequential, they may overlap these phases. And so therefore, what happens on the interface when the procurement phase ends and the construction phase begins? You have different people handling procurement from construction. Have they done their work properly? What are they handing over to the people in the next phase? What is falling through the gap in the middle? And even during one phase, like construction, the work taking place on site is different. You have your site clearance, excavation, foundations, building works, etc. Each one takes place often one before the other, but sometimes sequential, where one contractor may hand over work to another contractor. Again, a massive opportunities for things slipping through gaps or for people blaming each other, concealing problems. And each phase and activity involves different professions, different people, different organizations, which leads to difficulties in control and oversight. And inevitably, one participant blames another. So you say, what happened? Why are the foundations defective? That's the fault of design. No, it's not. It's the fault of the construction contractor. No, it's not. It's the fault of the supplier. Is this true? Who's to blame? Is it negligence? Is it corruption? It's very, very hard to work out. And again, within the confusion, corruption lurks. The cost of large projects, some projects are very large in scale. So inevitably, more money for a project, the more money can be lost, the more money is available for corruption. It's much easier to hide very large bribes and very large inflated claims in large projects than in a small project. Another factor, uniqueness of projects. Spotting corruption often requires comparison of prices. Is this price corruptly inflated? To judge whether it's corruptly inflated, you need a benchmark. What happens if you can't get a benchmark? Because infrastructure projects are different in size and content. Sometimes you have a series of same buildings, like in a housing estate. That's unusual. So it's very hard when you're looking for corruption and verifying the accuracy of pricing to get an accurate benchmark, because labor rates, equipment rates, material rates vary quite quickly, sometimes according to market demand, project type, and project location. And so if you are challenging the pricing of a project, you may get rebutted by people saying it's because the project is in that location, the market's gone up, or it's a difficult project. It's very hard to work out whether it's a genuine explanation or whether corruption is lurking in the pricing. So that is a real challenge as to in investigating corruption or preventing it, that projects are unique and hard to compare. Projects are complex. They're complex due to the nature of the work, the technical complexity, the number of organizations, the specialities we've discussed. So all the factors I've talked about in the previous slides result in an incredible complexity, which means the interrelationship between events is often uncertain. And if the interrelationship between events is uncertain, how do you identify what has gone wrong and why? And if you can't identify why, how can you identify whether something that has gone wrong is due to negligence, mistake, recklessness, deliberate act, corruption? And so often you find when projects have gone terribly badly wrong, massive projects, Parliament will implement an inquiry, and this inquiry will take many, many, many years. And at the end, they'll say lessons are to be learned. There was a lack of coordination and a bit of mistakes in design and everything, etc., etc., etc. What about the corruption? Did they look for the corruption? Did they not look for it in the investigation? Or could they not find it because it was too difficult to find because of the project complexity? When you challenge someone about a major problem, a major mistake in invoicing, or a major breach of quality, they say, oh, terribly sorry, we made a mistake. I don't know how that happened. The supervisor must have been asleep on the job. Terribly sorry, we'll fix it. Is that true? Or did they hope to get away with it? Was it a deliberate corrupt act? Very hard to identify. Location of projects makes corruption easier because it's easy to control a factory with a gate and a fence and controls over entry and exit. What about a road construction project over 10, 15, 20 kilometers? How do you control entry and access onto that? And if you can't control entry and access, how can you record who's there, who's working, when are they working, which again makes it very rife for corruption. People tending to have done work when they haven't done. It's hard to monitor and control the work in place. Also, if the project's a long way away, how do you get the inspectors to check it? Because it's a very significant distance, perhaps from head office. So location of projects can make, again, corruption easier to take place because of lack of monitoring and observation. Then concealment is also at the heart of corruption on infrastructure projects, because of course you want to conceal corruption for two reasons. One, you want to get away with it and get the money from the corrupt act. And two, you don't want to be caught because you don't want to be prosecuted and go to jail. So concealment is at the heart of all corrupt acts. This concealment falls, to my mind, into 5 categories. Concealed work, structures, methods, concealed ownership structures, untraceable payment methods, false documentation, and intermediaries. Let's have a look at these in turn. Many components in infrastructure are concealed by other components. For example, steel is concealed by concrete, brickwork is concealed by plaster, engineering components are concealed in casings, roof structure concealed in cladding. So as soon as you've put the steel into concrete, you can't see the steel anymore. You may be able to take a roof structure off, but it may not be easy. So as a result of this concealment, a lot of corruption can be hidden beneath subsequent layers, and therefore a huge dependence is placed by the industry on the certifiers, and huge opportunities are there for concealment of corrupt work and bribery of certifiers. So one aspect of concealment is concealing the work activities. Secondly, the ownership structures. If you have a conflict of interest, for example, a procurement manager or contractor actually may own wholly or partly a subcontractor and ensures the subcontractor wins a project. Unless you have very transparent ownership structures, it's very hard to find out whether your procurement manager does have an ownership interest in a supplier and is therefore appointing in a conflict of interest situation. So concealed ownership structures make it very easy to make corrupt profits on a project and very difficult to investigate. Untraceable payment methods. You can trace payment through the banking system, but if you're using cash at all, that's an untraceable payment method. But even if you're using payment methods through the banking system, as soon as offshore bank accounts get introduced, then those payment flows become very difficult to follow up. And so often corrupt transactions are laundered through the banking system into offshore accounts and through a number of intermediary accounts, making it very difficult to find out who is the ultimate beneficiary of the corrupt payment. False documentation is at the heart of corruption. It normally is involved in every corrupt act on a construction project. A bribe through an agent will be concealed through a false agency agreement. A fraudulent claim submitted by a contractor for work it never did or defective work will be concealed by a fake invoice and fake work records. Defective materials or workmanship are concealed by false certificates or false test certificates. So fake documentation is at the heart of construction contracts, and it's very easy to produce and quite difficult to identify. Although we will, in our investigation module later, give specific recommendations as to how to identify fake documents in construction. And finally, through intermediaries, you conceal, because you could make a bribe payment, for example, direct, but it's much more beneficial to the briber and bribee to do it indirectly through a third party. And there's several types of third party. The main ones are an agent, a joint venture partner, a subsidiary, a subcontractor, or those four. Because these four types of organization normally legitimate services on a construction project, if they also in parallel carry out illegitimate services, it's quite hard to identify whether their services are legitimate or illegitimate. Probably the main intermediary type is an agent, where a contractor or consultant appoints an agent to work with them on a project, particularly a sales agent working in another country, tendering internationally, and they'll enter into an agency agreement for support services for the project and for that company. Now, many agents are totally legitimate, do highly valuable work, and are very ethical, but the structure can enable corrupt agents as well, and it's very difficult often to tell the difference between them. If it's a corrupt agent, the contractor and agent enter into a false agency agreement, which is dressed up as a legitimate appointment with legitimate services, but in fact is a corrupt agreement. And the agency agreement is in fact, the agency payment, the fee or the commission, is in fact wholly or partly a bribe. When the agent receives the bribe on the contractor being awarded the contract, the agent will then pay the bribe to the public official who enabled the contract to be awarded to the contractor. And then the procurement official will have awarded the contract and will receive the bribe. So that's quite hard for the investigators to trace. They have to prove that the agency agreement is a fake, trace the money from the contractor through the agent's bank account to the procurement officer, which of course, if it's in an offshore bank account, may be hard to detect. So that's a classic method, and many of the prosecutions which have taken place internationally use that agency method. People are getting more sophisticated as investigators are now focusing on agents. So people are using more and more now other methods, one of which is the joint venture partner method. If you have two joint venture partners, if one is in a country where they have very strict controls and very good investigation, and the partner is in a country where the controls and investigation are of a lower level, the JV partners can agree that the partner in the country which is less likely to be investigated will be the facilitator of the bribe. So that joint venture partner will ensure that the bribe is paid either by the joint venture partner direct or through an intermediary to the procurement officer or the public official to enable the joint venture to win the project. And therefore, the bribe will be hidden in the joint venture payment. Subsidiary. If you're an international company and have subsidiaries in other countries, you appoint a subsidiary in a country where there's no investigation to be the payer of the bribe. And you can, through intercompany charges, intercompany payments, make sure the subsidiary company receives funds which are auditable through the intercompany network. And then through those funds, the subsidiary then illegally pays the bribe to the public official or the procurement officer to make sure the company is awarded a contract. And so therefore that many prosecutions internationally have discovered that method as well, where subsidiaries in a third country are used as the payer of the bribe. And any investigation to the parent company will not discover any bribery at all, because it's all been done separately by the subsidiary through the subsidiary's books. And finally, the subcontractor. If you have a subcontractor in a country where corruption is unlikely to be investigated, then the subcontractor pays the bribe. The subcontractor pays a bribe to the public official to make sure that the main contractor wins the contract. Once the main contractor wins the contract, the subcontractor wins the contract, and the subcontract price is inflated to include a bribe, and the subcontractor then passes it on to the procurement officer. So these are pretty obvious methods of concealing bribery in a project, but they're very hard to uncover or investigate, particularly if they are well disguised. So that's the final method of concealment, the intermediary. Moving on to another factor, lack of transparency. There's a general lack of transparency in the infrastructure worldwide, particularly in public sector projects. If you think about it, we, the taxpayer, are having our money spent by the public officials on our behalf. It's our money. We should have a right as the public to know exactly what is being spent and to have total transparency of pricing in public projects. But we don't get that from any country. We have disguise of payments, secrecy of payments, so-called commercial confidentiality. So the public never really knows why a company has won a project. They don't know what the competitors' prices were. They don't know what the variations involve. They don't know the pricing of the variations. It's all very concealed. The only people who know about it are the contractor and the public officials themselves, and the consulting engineer perhaps managing the project. If they're all involved in a corrupt arrangement, then no one will find out about corruption. And if we have full transparency in the construction sector, whereas a matter of course, public sector projects are put on the internet and public pricing and contract awards and variations and payments are made available to the public as they should be, it's going to be very hard to uncover the public sector corruption because it's concealed, it's opaque, it's not published. And of course, the public officials say they can't publish it due to commercial confidentiality, but that reason is entirely fake in my view. It's purely to protect the public officials' personal interests. The status quo is a problem. Many parts of the infrastructure, corruption has become so embedded that it's become part of the status quo. It's become the norm. And people in the industry shrug their shoulders and say, there's nothing we can do about it. They say, well, if we stop bribing, our competitors will not stop. We have to bribe in order to remain competitive. You know, we'll lose work. It's just not fair. We have to. The prisoner's dilemma. Or in fraud claims, we, the contractor, have to inflate a claim, because if we don't inflate the claim, the project owner will knock our claim down. Yeah, it's just good. It's just business. It's the rough and tumble of business. It's good business sense. It's not fraud. Everyone does it. Or for cartels, the market's very competitive. Prices are too low. We have to collaborate, you know, to make sure we can get better profits on our project. It's unfair. There's so much competition. People tend to justify the corruption in the industry. And as long as this justification continues, and as long as people shrug their shoulders and accept the status quo, nothing will change. We have to stand up and say, no, this isn't the status quo. The status quo is integrity, and we won't accept anything other than full integrity. There's also a perception of no victim, particularly in public sector works. People think the public sector is a bottomless pit. It's the government. No one owns the government. It's public money. It's the government's money. They don't see a victim. But in reality, public funds are the funds of the citizens. They are raised from taxes of public. If they borrow from banks, they have to be repaid out of taxes from the public. or revenue from public. So every dollar of public sector money is a dollar subscribed to by the public. So therefore, the public is the victim of corruption against the public sector. So it's very important to try through awareness raising to make people understand that there is a victim in the case of corruption against the public sector, and you are stealing money from your neighbors if you actually defraud money from the public sector. They are victims. There's instant reporting of corruption. There are many reasons why people don't like reporting corruption in the infrastructure sector. Firstly, there's a lack of monitoring or supervision. And if you don't monitor or supervise, you won't spot the corruption, and therefore there's nothing to report. Therefore, people have to monitor and supervise better to be able to identify corruption, to be able to report it. Secondly, there's a lack of awareness, as we touched on earlier, as to the different types of corruption, and a lack of awareness that they may be criminal offences. People may not understand what is fraud. They may not understand that these actions, which are part of the status quo, are actually criminal offences. Or even if they do understand, there may not be adequate reporting structures in place where they can safely or confidentially report the corruption they've witnessed. Or even if they can report, if they believe nothing will happen, they won't bother to report. There must be a genuine belief that something will happen to motivate people to report. And also, lastly, of course, fully acknowledge fear. People do genuinely and for good reason fear retaliation. So we have to be very careful how we can put in place a system which genuinely protects people from retaliation, protects their anonymity and confidentiality, and ensures that they can't be retaliated against. So we need better reporting structures. Even if there is good reporting, that's no good unless we have proper prosecution. If you don't have proper prosecution, then people will carry on normally because they do not fear being found out and dealt with. Unless there's clear evidence that corruption will be genuinely, fairly, and effectively investigated and prosecuted, unscrupulous individuals and companies will continue to act corruptly. Now, this lack of prosecution could be due to corruption itself, because the prosecutors may themselves be corrupt, or it could be due to government inaction, that government just does not mobilize effective prosecution resources, or it could be due to lack of resources, just not enough money, not enough people, or it could be due to lack of coordination nationally or internationally. It could be due to many reasons, but unless we have proper prosecution in place, we are not going to wipe out corruption, because even if most of us act ethically, there are always going to be some people amongst us who won't. And unless we can weed them out and deal with them, it's going to continue. There's also, touching on my second point from earlier, a very significant lack of anti-corruption controls. I'll touch on that only very briefly here as a factor, but this is a hugely important factor. And we're going to deal with this in workshops 5 and 6, the prevention controls. What controls do you have to put in place to stop corruption on a construction budget? We'll look at that in a lot of detail in workshops 5 and 6. But suffice to say here, there's a distinct lack of control worldwide in government, in corporations, and on projects. Corruption can only be effectively stopped if you properly put controls in place to control the money, to control the procurement, to control the project management, control your sales, and put proper monitoring, supervision, and audit in place. If you don't have these controls in place in government and in corporations, both public and private sector, and on projects, corruption will run amok. And therefore, that's hugely important. At the moment, worldwide, we do not have a proper control environment in place. The good news is we know now exactly what those controls have to be. We know what to do. They're proven. We can put them in place. We just need the ambition and ability of our public sector officials and our leaders actually to implement them for us to be able to succeed. So in conclusion, All these factors I just mentioned all combine to facilitate corruption on construction projects, and they make corruption harder to prevent and detect. Construction projects are complex in their contractual structure. They have complex contractual documentation. They have a huge range of people and organizations involved with different skills. They have a number of interfaces between them and all the work they're doing. There are different phases where work is handed over from one entity to another. There's a huge ability to conceal work using intermediaries, other parts of work, false documentation. There are just so many opportunities in the construction project to act corruptly. And other factors make it more difficult to monitor, like the location of the project, or harder to detect because you've got a lack of supervision, a lack of control, harder to compare because projects are different. So all these factors work together to make it really difficult to stop corruption on construction projects and really easy for it to take place. But the good news is, as I mentioned earlier, we do know how to stop it, and we can do that. And there are 3 steps, as I mentioned in my very first introduction. We've got to raise awareness about how corruption takes place in the infrastructure sector and how it can be prevented. People must know everything about it, how it takes place and what to do. Secondly, we've got to put these controls in place throughout government, throughout organizations, and on the projects, which can effectively prevent and monitor for corruption. And thirdly, we have to put effective monitoring, reporting, investigation, and prosecution in place to deal with any corruption which takes place. We know how to do it. We've got the tools and resources. All we have to do is now do it. So that brings me to, and SEP workshops cover all those aspects. I'm going to deal with all of that in the later workshops. I'm going to deal with controls, and I'm going to deal with how it takes place, and I'm going to deal with how to investigate it. So I've just put together 3 brief slides here, just as a final conclusion to illustrate what I've been saying. And these following 3 slides illustrate 3 value outcomes. Projects which have no effective controls in place, a project which have some effective controls, and a project which has effective controls. So if I look at that, here is a project which has very poor controls in place. The blue is the project. It's a pipe, a water pipe. The green is water being put through the pipe at high pressure, and that represents cash. So you pump cash in at high pressure like water through a pipe, but it's leaking. All the red marks are major leaks in that pipe. So in all your different phases of the project from beginning to end, your selection of the project, your funding project, your planning, your design, your procurement, your construction, your operation and maintenance, all these phases have massive leaks because of lack of control. And therefore you pump the cash in under pressure, nothing much comes out, a corrupt project. What happens if we have some controls in place, which is probably true of many projects? So you have good controls over selection, over funding, you could put bad controls, design bad controls, construction bad controls. That's very common. It's very common to have good controls in procurement, but very poor controls over construction. What's going to happen? You pump the cash in under pressure like water. It's going to come out of those remaining holes under even higher pressure. You may have a bit better value out, but not good enough. You're still losing a lot. The only solution is to plug all of the holes. You've got to put controls in place right the way through the contract structure from beginning to end throughout all the phases. Only then will you get the value out of the project that you put in. So thank you very much for listening to that, and I'll hand back to Kamel now.
Thank you, Neill. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation. I think you have eloquently demonstrated a real diagnosis about the vulnerability of the infrastructure projects and where corruption can occur, because the common belief that corruption occurs usually in the tendering phase, whereas corruption could occur in the whole cycle of the project, from the design to the tendering phase, to the execution, to the maintenance, and so on. So though this is very, very interesting to know. And I very much like the analogy and the metaphor with the water pump. And if you wanted to fix one leak, you have to fix all of them together. Otherwise, the water will come out one of the not fixed leak. So this is very, very interesting, and I think that we will have in the coming sessions other opportunities to discuss and to come back to all these issues, because we don't have a lot of time now for discussion. We are running behind time. We will just allow for 20 minutes of discussion, 5 minutes for brief remarks from two panelists, and 5 minutes to Susan to make some announcement. But let me go back to one of the fundamental goals of this initiative. And you would recall when we discussed about this, Neill, that since the intention is to make out of these content trainings that could be delivered in different parts, so some refinement and customization are necessary. And for this reason, we wanted to expose the content of this training to different people with different backgrounds and with different experiences from different contexts. So please, perhaps we cannot do this in this session because of time, but in the future, what we expect also from you is to come up with your case study, your experience, so that we can integrate them and we make out of these courses training that could be delivered whatever the context is. So before opening the floor, I wanted just to make a comment, Neill, on your presentation, and then I will open the floor to questions and comments. In slide 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24, you focus on the procurement officers. And from what you have presented, perhaps the notion of procurement officers should be clarified, because there is no one single person who plays the role, particularly in declaring who is the winner of the tender. So it's not only one single person, it's usually a selection committee. So it looks as if this procurement officer is the devil in the whole system. Whereas in many experience, the selection is not the role of one single person, it's the selection of a committee. And there are a lot of guarantees in that specific cycle of the project, where those who are not happy with the result, the outcome of the selection committee, they can challenge the decision of the selection committee to the court. So there are a lot, I don't know, I'm speaking about the context of our country, but I guess that it's the same, because there are a lot of things that have been done to fix the corruption at the tendering phase. So what do you mean by procurement officer? And if it's a single person, I don't think that there is a single person who is the only one to make the decision. The decision is diluted and is shared between a number of people, and it could be challenged because the tendering phase, the selection phase is a transparent process almost everywhere. So I wouldn't see that a lot of corruption vulnerability exists in that site.
That's a very good point, Kamel. I take your point fully. The intention was just to simplify the concept, but I think the word procurement officer is not a good word. And based on what you say, I would suggest changing that to maybe public officials, perhaps in the plural, just to create the concept that money may be going to several people to secure the order. I think that's a very good observation. I don't know if in your view whether public officials would be a good resolution.
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps. But
Yeah.
it depends on the context of the country, yeah. Who is the decision? Okay, now we will open, we will have two panelists who will provide some comments. And I hope that in the future, we will allow for more people if someone feel able to contribute in a meaningful way. This is what we expect from these sessions. So we will please feel free to channel your questions through the Q&A questions, and they will be dealt with by Susan, and they will be reported to Neill Stansbury to provide answer to that. Susan, who are the two panelists who will now provide their comments?
Okay, basically, we have Michael Kramer, who is here with us. He will be providing some comments for us. Because of time, we will take his comments. But beyond that, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. In fact, we have one from Kausa Hamid. Pardon me if I don't pronounce your name correctly, who has listed about 6 questions. I don't know how we're going to take that, but I will also invite the speaker and the panelists to try to answer some of the questions straight there in the Q&A box. But then let me quickly take one question from him. And then the first question there amongst the 6 questions asked is, what are the most effective legal frameworks used globally to combat corruption, and how can developing countries implement them effectively? So if either Neill, Kamel, or anyone on the panel want to address this, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm happy to take one simple one. Is ISO 37001 is an international anti-bribery certification for organizations, which was published by the International Standardization Organization. It's a part of the suite of standards, ISO 9001 quality, 14001 environment, and 45001 safety, which an organization can implement. And it's specifically an anti-bribery management standard for an organization. To achieve that certification, a company has to have a very high level of integrity proven and implement a series of very strict controls in their organization to ensure that they are acting ethically and without bribery in all their operations worldwide. The standard can be certified by an independent certifier. And I would therefore answer your question by saying the most simple approach would be that public sector procurement bodies should require all bidding companies for projects over a minimum value threshold should not be allowed to tender for public sector projects unless they have independent certification to ISO 37001. So that would be my simple and immediate response to your question.
Thank you, Neill. I have seen that Dr. Raida Alawi is raising a hand. Please go ahead and address the question.
Let me introduce Raida Alawi. Raida is the chairperson of the Bahrain Society of Engineers. She is also member of the advisory board of the MENA region, Globethics MENA. So please, the floor is yours, Raida.
Yeah, you're muted, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamel. Thank you for the invitation and for this really very interesting workshop. Thanks, Neill, for the useful and really informative session. I just have a small things to say that while corruption in construction projects is really a major concern, we must also recognize that corruption is increasingly in many other sectors, such as health and education. But from my major, my interest is in the ICT sector. Now, especially with the rise of the digital transformation of those large organizations. So this rapid integration of the technology into the critical infrastructure introduce new opportunities for different kind of really type of corruption and unethical practices, including the manipulation of data or the biased algorithm or the procurement irregularities. So I will suppose it is really essential that we can get experts in this field to address these challenges from the ethical perspective.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Doctor. Yeah.
Michael, the floor is yours. Michael will be one of the instructors in the future. And Mike is specialized in investigation of infrastructure projects. He worked for, I think, 2 decades for the World Bank in this area, and he has a lot of expertise. Please, Mike.
Yes, thank you very much, Kamel, and thank you very much for inviting me to serve as a panelist. I very much enjoyed Neill's presentation, and even with my 20 or 30 years of experience, I did learn something. So thank you very much, Neill. So in later sessions, I'm going to be going over in very precise detail, precise steps. How do you detect corruption and fraud in infrastructure project? What are the red flags? How do you match the red flags to the team? Specifically, what do you do to detect and prove and prevent corruption? But in the short time I have here today, I'd just like to emphasize a couple of points about the importance of this training. First of all, it's widely reported that over the next several decades, trillions of dollars, literally tens of trillions of dollars, that's thousands of billions of dollars, are going to be spent on improving infrastructure around the world, including billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, sometimes even estimates of $1 trillion or more a year to combat climate change and to promote green infrastructure projects. And many of these, especially the green infrastructure projects, are in high-risk areas, developing parts of the world, and the international lenders are very concerned about the risk of fraud in these projects. For example, in green infrastructure, combating climate change, the World Bank has announced publicly that they fear, quote, catastrophic consequences unless these projects, which are mostly infrastructure, mostly construction, unless they are protected from fraud and corruption. So I think it's most important, most timely to have this series of programs about how to recognize, how to combat fraud and corruption in infrastructure projects. Secondly, again, very, very quickly, I was a prosecutor in the United States. I did fraud and corruption cases as a prosecutor. I did investigations for the World Bank and the UN, but almost all of my work and the work of colleagues of mine were in procurement frauds. We had very few whistleblower complaints about construction fraud. We didn't understand it very well. And in the cases in which we had to address construction fraud, because we didn't understand it, we didn't know what to do. We couldn't recognize the red flags. We didn't know where to get the evidence. We had time limits. We had budget limits. And so many times our efforts were defeated by our lack of knowledge. And so I think it would be extremely helpful in the industry to exploit the knowledge of civil engineers who already understand construction. They understand infrastructure works. And we can add to their knowledge of the construction works. We can train them on the knowledge of fraud detection. So we have a good partnership between the fraud investigators and the engineers who can do a much better, much more effective job in combating fraud and corruption in major infrastructure projects. So I look forward to talking in the future about more specifics. So thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much. Susan, if you wanted to go through some of the questions, or I can just pick some of them. I see that, yeah.
Okay, please go ahead then.
The last question, how to make difference? I think you touched on this, Neill, how to make difference between corruption and mismanagement, because it seems that in our countries, all is put in the basket of corruption for populism reasons or for ignorance. This is, I think, question from Tunisia. Another question, do you want to answer this question, Neill, and that we come to the second one? Yes, please.
Let me, because I can't remember 2 questions at the same time, so I'll do one. Right. Yes, it's a very good question. It's very interesting. And I think Mike Kramer, as Mike just touched on, will probably look at this quite a bit in his workshop, because there are ways you can tell the difference, but it does require detailed investigation, because if you investigate corruption, people are always going to rely on mismanagement as an excuse. They're first of all going to say it was a mistake, an accident. Then they may acknowledge it was neglect or oversight, but they'll never admit to corruption ever. So the way to look at this is you look at all the circumstances of the case. You look at the actions, you get all the documents relevant to that action, you interview all the people who are connected with the action, and you try and build up a picture of what happened. If the picture points only to one rational conclusion, that rational conclusion being corruption, you are entitled in most criminal legal jurisdictions to infer criminal intent to that action. You never actually have to prove that corruption 100% happened. All you have to do is prove that the only reasonable explanation of that act was a corrupt act. And so if you look at many corrupt activities on construction sites, you say, I cannot believe that any engineer with your skill and experience honestly would have taken that action other than for a corrupt reason. It just makes no sense. Of course, if it's a toss-up between negligence and corruption, you can't establish either way. You can't prove corruption. But in my view, and I'm sure Mike will have many interesting tales on this, you can often tell when something's corrupt because you say, this is the only reasonable explanation. So the problem in most countries, as you touched on, is the government investigation stops at mismanagement. They declare it to be mismanagement and they stop, either because they want to, because they don't want to prosecute corruption, or because it gets too difficult and expensive. And so the same happens in the UK. They stop at mismanagement and they don't dig deeper. We have to dig deeper.
Yeah, thank you. And another question. This came from Michael Avery. Is the level of corruption around the world increasing, reducing, or staying the same? I think it's hard to answer this question, but what's your feeling about this question, Neill and Mike? Yeah.
Yeah. I'll answer first and then ask Mike to give his opinion. But I just don't know. It's a total guess because we haven't a clue how much corruption takes worldwide. People give estimates. They say 5% of the world GDP is corruption, but no one really knows, because if we knew how much corruption took place, we would have found out it all and stopped it. And because, as I described in my talk now, it's so well concealed and so well hidden that we don't know most of it. So my guess from what I hear is it's getting worse worldwide. The money supply is getting bigger, the world's GDP is getting bigger, and controls are not improving. I fear it's getting worse, but I can't prove that. I don't know, Mike, if you have any feeling on that from your experience.
Well, unfortunately, over the 30 years that I've been doing this, I'm sad to say that I can't cite any evidence that it's getting better. There are a couple of countries in which, domestically at least, there has been progress against domestic corruption. South Korea, for example, and some Eastern European countries have made dramatic changes in how they address domestic corruption and have held their public officials accountable and have sent them to jail. But in most parts of the world, I haven't seen any improvement whatsoever, and I haven't seen any real accountability within the countries themselves. So as one of the speakers said, there seems to be in corrupt countries not only a culture of corruption, but even more importantly, a culture of impunity. The corrupt officials control the auditors, the investigators, the media, and they act with impunity. And I'm sad to say I haven't seen any improvement in that area at all.
Oh, thank you. Another question is about the importance and the role of internal control processes to prevent fraud and corruption. And I think what is meant also is the role of audit, because it's made by an auditor. So, Mike, I think you have a lot of experience in investigating corruption. Do you think that in every country there is a system to prevent corruption, auditors and internal control, et cetera, et cetera? Do you think that this contributes to reducing the level of corruption? What do you see as when you are asked about the role of audit? Does it play any role and control to reduce the level of corruption?
Well, again, I think as Neill has indicated in his speech, to prevent corruption is a combination of a number of efforts. First of all, it's the policies and procedures of an agency. It's the tone at the top. It's the ethical standards of the agency and of the country and of the bureaucrats. It's the skill and of the auditors and the authority of the auditors. And of course, it's the resources available, the investigators. So in other words, without going on and on, it's a combination of all sorts of factors and people to detect, prevent, improve corruption. As we just said a minute ago, we haven't seen hardly any improvement despite so much emphasis on this for 30 years. For example, the World Bank has spent fortunes on trying to teach how to implement these things and so on. I think one thing in the future, just to be very brief, one thing that offers promise for the future is the ability to digitize, to exploit the trend towards digital records, which provides much greater controls and much better oversight than having to rely on paper documents and very, very complicated things. So there's a trend to digitization. In the United States, it's quite powerful. In the United States, the Infrastructure Act anti-fraud provisions includes $100 million, which is set aside to expedite the digitization of construction contracts. That much money just to digitize contracts, because it believes that with a digital record, it'll be much easier to identify and prevent corruption. I'm really excited about this in the future. I hope to talk about it more in the future.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. Another question is about the role of whistleblowers and the whistleblower protection laws be strengthened internationally to encourage the reporting of corruption without fear of retaliation. What's your feeling about the role of whistleblowers? Are they playing a crucial role in denouncing and reporting corruption? And
in my experience, absolutely. It's impossible to overemphasize. So virtually every major case I've done in the international community started with a whistleblower. And the case would not have been detected without the report. And in many cases, the investigation would fail without the continued cooperation of a whistleblower. And whistleblowers, as Neill said, are rare. And there are many, many honest people and agencies around the world that are aware of corruption and are afraid to report it for two reasons. One, they fear retaliation. And two, they fear that nothing will be done. In other words, they know of other people who reported and it was ignored. And so the important thing about encouraging whistleblowers, which is absolutely important, is not so much whistleblower protection. It's not so much the laws. Whistleblowers aren't really concerned about, having the ability to file a lawsuit if they're fired, which is whistleblower protection. What they're concerned about is anonymity, and they're concerned that something will be done. And if you have those two factors, people will complain, and having the cooperation of whistleblowers is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential.
Sure. Another question, I think it's directed to you, Neill. This, as you have said, untraceable payments are difficult to trace. How will you be able to trace cash payment, especially to the big shots in public officials?
Yeah, it's a good question and very difficult. It's something, funny enough, Mike Kramer and myself and our colleague Tom Lasich have been working on recently, is there are methods of tracing payments through the banking system, which is why it's critical that all payments always should be made through the international banking system, because it leaves a footprint. But you need to start from one end or the other. So if you find a payment from a contractor and you want to know where it's gone, you have to ask their bank you need to get proper legal authority from the prosecution agency to require that bank to hand over the information of who it was paid to. The bank is obliged to do so. If that bank is from another country, it gets more difficult. But there is a mutual legal assistance in place between most countries in the world, which entitles the prosecution authorities to ask the other country's prosecution authorities for cooperation. That authority will then go to their bank and require them to disclose who the recipient was. And sometimes it takes a long time because it may go through even more banks than just those two. And unfortunately, it takes time and money. And some countries will not cooperate. And then the trail may go dry. But in principle, there is a system in international banking and international law enforcement where you can follow each payment through the banking system by court order and by mutual legal assistance application until you get to the ultimate beneficiary. And once you find the ultimate beneficiary is, for example, a public official who is responsible for a contract award, you've won your case. But it's difficult and expensive, but it's possible.
An anonymous participant asked a number of questions. I can't provide all of them, but I will pick one of them. How can anti-corruption bodies ensure independence and impartiality in investigation, especially in politically sensitive environments?
Yeah.
That's
Mike is probably better at that than me.
That is the question, isn't it? Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately quite sincerely, many anti-corruption bodies in many parts of the world lack independence. They are subject to political pressures from the top, and they are ineffective. The World Bank 8 or 9 years ago placed a great deal of its anti-corruption strategy on reinforcing, assisting local anti-corruption agencies in the countries, and they found that many of them were under such negative political pressure and were staffed by political appointees of corrupt officials that they were ineffective. And so the bank abandoned that as a primary strategy. So that, again, we can talk about this for hours, but one thing that question indicates to me, and what I would suggest is that in my 30 years of experience, I've discovered it in a lot of countries, the corruption problem is political. The solution is political. We have good engineers, we have good auditors, we have honest workers, we have people that want good services, we have people that are smart that can deliver it. It's the political pressure of the corrupt elite that prevents that from happening. Now, with me, believe me, I wish I knew how to address those political issues. That is the question in many countries. It's political.
Yeah, I fully agree with you that it's a political issue, corruption. But the problem, would you advise political leaders if they wanted to address corruption? Because we have witnessed throughout the history of combating corruption, political leaders, they prosecuted a number of people, but corruption has emerged again. You would recall the clean hands of Italy in 1990. Hundreds of parliamentarians were jailed, and 2 prime ministers were also jailed. But a few years later, corruption has increased again, and even the convicted prime minister Berlusconi won the election again. So do you think that it's only a problem of political will? Because we see everywhere prosecution, and to the extent that nowadays we criticize the anti-corruption policies which are based on prosecution and enforcement, and we call for a combined approach between integrity and enforcement. So if we categorize that the problem of its political problem, and we see everywhere that political leaders taking decision to corrupt, and the number of companies were prosecuted, the number of high officials were prosecuted, but this doesn't end corruption. So I don't think that it's only a problem of political, because what political leaders can do is to send people to jail. Whereas what they should do is to create and to build the prevention system, and to improve and to reinforce a prevention system, which is the only way perhaps to address corruption, rather than relying only on enforcement and prosecution.
Right. Well, I certainly agree with that. I certainly agree that there has to be a system in place that ensures integrity and so on, and not relying completely on auditors and investigators that can try to catch people who break the law. As far as how to affect political change, how to do that, my goodness, I know we've tried to do that for decades. One thing I can say is there's some recent initiatives to hold political leaders accountable in international courts. And whether or not that would be effective, whether or not there'd be support for that. And the other thing is, it's kind of an academic comment, it's kind of general, is that the academics, when they write about how to affect political change, they talk about the maturity of the population. In other words, in many countries in which the political leaders are endemically corrupt, they are able to do so because the population doesn't have the power or the interest or the enthusiasm to do anything. And so all of those are just very general comments I'm embarrassed to make because I really can't cite any successes in advances. But, you know, in our programs that are coming up, we'll try to make step-by-step progress, and we'll try to address this issue as best we can.
Okay, thank you very much. I apologize because I was not able to go through all the questions that were put in the chat box. So we will have opportunities to address them in the future. Perhaps now I will go back to Susan because she has some announcement and then we conclude this session. So thank you so much. Thank you very much, Neill. Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for all the attendees who are participating despite different time zone, and I know that for some participants it should be too late, and so thank you very much, and we will see each other in 2 weeks. So now, Susan, it's you.
All right, thank you so much, Kamel. And let me just say thank you to our panelists and also to all our participants. If you will go into the chat box, you will see that there's been quite some engagements, interesting engagements ongoing there. Thank you so much for engaging this session with your comments and with already the interactions you are having. Just a quick announcement, and then we are out of here. The next session of this training Yes, just a minute. So we will continue the training in about 2 weeks' time on the 23rd of October, Wednesday, at 15 CET, Central European Time. We want to quickly apologize. There was a little confusion about the time in starting today, but the next session is in 2 weeks. We will send again this schedule of training to everybody so that those who may not have received it will get to know what the plan is for the remaining training sessions. So this is just for your information. We've had several requests about the video recording. This session is being recorded and it will also be shared with all participants. So please look out for that. And please, if you have any inquiries, any questions, address them to MENA-events@globethics.net, and then we'll get back to you with the necessary feedback. I think that is all I have so that we can round up and be out of here. Thank you so much. Over to you, Kamel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay. All right then. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for your time. Bye. Bye.